The sun had just begun to crest over the manicured hedges of Whispering Pines, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Oakwood Heights. The morning dew still clung to the perfectly trimmed grass as 72-year-old Joe Williams knelt in the front garden of 1842 Maple Avenue. His weathered hands worked methodically, pulling weeds from around the rosebushes he'd planted last spring. Joe wiped sweat from his brow with the sleeve of his faded denim shirt. The shirt had seen better days, just like Joe himself, but both still had plenty of life left in them. The tattered straw hat shielded his eyes from the morning sun as he hummed an old Stevie Wonder tune. For nearly 5 decades, Joe had quietly built a real estate empire throughout Oakwood Heights. What started with a single fixer-upper purchased with his military savings in 1975 had grown to ownership of over 40 properties across 3 neighborhoods. But you'd never know it by looking at him. Joe drove the same pickup truck he'd bought in 1998, wore clothes until they were threadbare, and lived in a modest 3-bedroom home just outside the Whispering Pines gates. 1842 Maple Avenue was special to Joe. It was the first property he'd purchased within Whispering Pines 15 years ago, when the neighborhood was still being developed. The previous tenants had moved out last month, and Joe was personally preparing it for the next family. He could have hired someone, but gardening brought him peace. "Excuse me. You there. What do you think you're doing?" The shrill voice cut through the morning tranquility like a siren. Joe turned slowly, his knees creaking in protest as he rose to his full height of 6'2". Standing at the edge of the property was a woman he'd never seen before. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, designer sunglasses perched on her nose despite the early hour. She wore an expensive-looking tennis outfit and clutched a small dog under one arm. "Good morning," Joe said with a polite nod. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" The woman's lips thinned to a tight line as she looked Joe up and down, taking in his worn clothes and dirt-covered hands. "I asked what you're doing on this property," she repeated, her voice colder than before. "Just tending to these roses," Joe replied calmly. "They need special attention this time of year." The woman stepped forward, keeping a careful distance as if Joe might be contagious. "This is private property in a gated community. How did you even get in here?" Joe chuckled softly. "I have permission to be here, ma'am." "From whom?" "The owners are gone. I'm Veronica Prescott, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, and I know for a fact this house is vacant." Joe leaned on his garden spade and studied Veronica. At around 48, she had the look of someone used to getting her way. The kind of person who demanded to speak to managers and wrote strongly worded emails to customer service departments. "The property isn't vacant, Ms. Prescott. It's between tenants." Veronica's dog, a tiny Pomeranian with a diamond-studded collar, yapped aggressively at Joe. "Hush, Valentino," she cooed before her expression hardened again. "I don't know who you think you are, but we don't allow random landscapers to work unsupervised in Whispering Pines. Where's your truck? Your uniform? Your credentials?" Joe gestured toward his old pickup parked in driveway. "That's my truck right there. Don't need a uniform for my own gardens." "Your gardens?" Veronica scoffed. "I've been HOA president for 3 months now, and I've never seen you at a single meeting." "What's your name?" "Joe Williams, ma'am." Veronica pulled out her phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be a resident directory. "There's no Joe Williams on my list of approved homeowners or residents." Joe smiled patiently. "I might be listed under Joseph. Or maybe the property management company is listed instead." "Don't try to confuse me," Veronica snapped. "I know every homeowner in Whispering Pines. Now, I'm going to have to ask you to leave before I call security." Joe's smile never faltered, but a weary shadow passed across his eyes. He'd encountered people like Veronica before. People who looked at his dark skin and worn clothes and made immediate assumptions. "I have every right to be here, Ms. Prescott, but I don't want any trouble. I'll just finish up with these roses and be on my way." Joe turned back to his gardening, effectively dismissing her. This was clearly not the response Veronica expected. "Excuse me. I am speaking to you." Her voice rose an octave. "This is a violation of HOA regulations. No unauthorized personnel are allowed on vacant properties." Joe continued working, his large hands delicately pruning a thorny stem. Veronica's face flushed red. "I'm calling security right now. And the police." As she furiously dialed on her phone, Joe sighed and continued his work. He could have ended this situation with a single sentence, but decades of experience had taught him that people like Veronica Prescott needed to learn lessons the hard way. 10 minutes later, a Whispering Pines security SUV pulled up to the curb. A young guard named Dwayne stepped out, looking uncomfortable as Veronica immediately descended upon him. Finally, this man is trespassing on private property. I want him removed immediately and cited for breaking HOA regulations. Dwayne approached cautiously. Good morning, sir. There seems to be a misunderstanding. Joe stood up straight and smiled warmly. Morning, Dwayne. How's your mother doing? Has her hip been giving her less trouble since the surgery? Dwayne broke into a relieved smile. Much better, Mr. Williams. She's even talking about going back to her water aerobics class next month. Thanks for asking. Veronica looked between them, confusion and indignation battling on her face. You know this man? Of course, Dwayne replied. This is Mr. Williams. He's just an old man who loves his roses. Joe interrupted gently, giving Dwayne a subtle shake of his head. Ms. Prescott was concerned about finding me here. Dwayne seemed to catch on immediately. Mr. Williams has authorization to be here, ma'am. Everything's in order. Veronica's eyes narrowed suspiciously. What kind of authorization? From whom? The property owner has given permission, Dwayne said carefully. And who exactly is the property owner? Veronica demanded. Because as HOA president, I should have this information. Before Dwayne could respond, an expensive SUV pulled into the driveway next door. A middle-aged woman stepped out, waving enthusiastically. Joe, I thought that was you, she called out. Are you finally fixing up the Jacobson place? Joe waved back with a warm smile. Morning, Eleanor. Just tending to the roses before the new tenants move in next week. Eleanor Bailey, a prominent local judge, approached the small group gathered on the lawn. Her presence seemed to momentarily silence Veronica. The roses look beautiful as always, Eleanor said before noticing the tension in the air. Is everything all right? Just a misunderstanding, Joe replied mildly. Ms. Prescott here is new to the neighborhood. Eleanor's eyebrows rose as she regarded Veronica. Oh, you must be the new resident in the Markham rental on Sycamore Drive. Welcome to Whispering Pines. She turned back to Joe. Will you be at the neighborhood barbecue next weekend? Thomas is looking forward to getting your advice on his retirement portfolio. Wouldn't miss it, Joe assured her. Veronica looked increasingly confused and frustrated. Excuse me, but this man claims to have permission to be on this property, and I'm simply trying to verify. Oh, Joe has permission to be anywhere in Whispering Pines, Eleanor interrupted with a laugh. If it weren't for him, half this neighborhood wouldn't exist. Joe shot Eleanor a warning glance, but the damage was done. Veronica's eyes widened as she tried to reconcile the well-connected man everyone seemed to respect with the shabby gardener she'd tried to have removed. I don't understand, Veronica said stiffly. If you're so connected, why haven't I seen you at any HOA meetings? Joe brushed dirt from his hands. Never been much for meetings, Ms. Prescott. I prefer to let the community handle those things. Veronica wasn't satisfied. Well, as HOA president, I need to know exactly what your role is here. Who is the actual owner of this property? The paperwork lists a company called JW Holdings. Joe smiled. Like I said, I have permission to be here. Frustrated by Joe's evasiveness, Veronica turned to Eleanor. Judge Bailey, surely you understand my position. As HOA president, I need to know who owns properties in our community. Eleanor glanced at Joe, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. I'm sure all the proper information is filed with the HOA, Eleanor said diplomatically. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a court session in an hour. Joe, don't forget to bring those heirloom tomato seedlings you promised me. As Eleanor departed, Veronica turned back to Joe with renewed determination. This isn't over, Mr. Williams. I'll be filing a formal complaint about this incident. You do what you feel is necessary, Ms. Prescott, Joe said calmly as he returned to his gardening. These roses won't prune themselves. Veronica stormed off, her tiny dog barking frantically over her shoulder. Once she was out of earshot, Dwayne turned to Joe. Why didn't you just tell her who you are, Mr. Williams? Joe watched Veronica's retreating figure with a thoughtful expression. Some lessons can't be told, Dwayne. They have to be experienced. He paused, then added quietly, Besides, I found that people show you who they really are when they think you can't do anything for them or to them. As Joe returned to his beloved roses, he had no idea that this was just the first skirmish in what would become a neighborhood battle of wills, one that would ultimately reveal far more than just who owned 1842 Maple Avenue. 3 days after their first encounter, Joe pulled into the driveway of 1842 Maple Avenue to find a bright orange violation notice taped to the front door. He plucked it off with a sigh and read the official-looking document. Notice of violation. Unauthorized landscaping changes without HOA approval. Penalty $250. Contact HOA office immediately. Signed, Veronica Prescott, HOA President. Joe folded the notice carefully and tucked it into his pocket. As he rounded the corner of the house to check on his newly planted hydrangeas, he spotted a familiar figure marching across the lawn. Mr. Williams, Veronica called out, clipboard in hand. I'm glad I caught you. Did you see the violation notice? I did, Joe replied calmly, though I'm confused about what violation occurred. These are the same flowers that have been here for years. Veronica's lips curled into a thin smile. I've been reviewing the property records. According to HOA bylaws, any landscaping changes must be approved by the committee. There's no record of approval for these modifications. Joe gestured to the beautiful gardens surrounding them. These gardens have been here for 15 years, Ms. Prescott, long before your time as president. Nevertheless, she continued, the current board hasn't approved them. And as I investigate further, I found several other violations. She flipped through her clipboard. Unauthorized paint color on the garden shed, unapproved solar lighting along the walkway, and she paused dramatically, a serious question about your authorization to be on this property at all. Joe leaned on his walking stick. Is that so? Yes. I've contacted JW Holdings through their registered agent. Until I receive confirmation that you're authorized to be here, I must insist you vacate the premises. And if I don't, Veronica's smile tightened. Then I'll be forced to call the authorities. Again. I see, Joe said softly. Well, you do what you feel is necessary. Frustration flashed across Veronica's face. Why are you being so difficult? Just show me documentation proving you have permission to be here. I don't need to prove anything to you, Ms. Prescott. But I am curious. What makes you so certain I don't belong here? The question seemed to catch Veronica off guard. It's not about belonging. It's about following the rules. Rules that apply to everyone. Do they? Joe asked, his voice gentle but firm. I wonder, did you issue violation notices to the Hendersons when they planted tulips last fall? Or to Dr. Rivera when he installed a new mailbox? Veronica's cheeks flushed. That's different. How so? Unable to articulate an answer that wouldn't reveal her prejudice, Veronica changed tactics. The fact remains, these violations must be addressed. You have 72 hours to remove the unauthorized plantings and pay the fine. As she turned to leave, Joe called after her. Ms. Prescott, I understand you recently moved into 367 Sycamore Drive. Veronica froze. How do you know where I live? Joe smiled mysteriously. It's a small community. Word gets around. He didn't mention that he owned the property she was renting through Lakeside Property Management, one of his subsidiary companies. The following week brought 3 more violation notices and 2 visits from local police. Each time the officers, many of whom knew Joe well, apologized for the disturbance and left without taking action. Veronica's frustration grew with each failed attempt to remove Joe from the property. What she didn't know was that Joe had been quietly investigating her as well. Through his property management company, he discovered that Veronica had moved to Whispering Pines following a messy divorce. She'd used her settlement money to rent one of the most expensive homes in the neighborhood, one of Joe's properties, and had immediately run for HOA president, campaigning on a platform of maintaining property values and community standards. On a warm Thursday evening, Joe sat in his modest home office reviewing documents when his phone rang. Joe, it's Eleanor. You need to know what's happening. Veronica's called an emergency HOA meeting for tomorrow night. The agenda says it's about security concerns and vagrant activity in the neighborhood. Joe chuckled softly. I see. This isn't funny, Joe. She's systematically building a case against you. Several neighbors who don't know you personally are getting concerned because of the way she's framing it. Let her have her meeting, Eleanor. But Joe, sometimes people need to show everyone exactly who they are, Joe said. Will you do me a favor, though? Make sure the meeting is recorded for the official minutes. The next evening, Whispering Pines residents gathered in the community clubhouse. Joe slipped in quietly, taking a seat in the back corner, wearing a blazer over his usual casual clothes. Few people noticed him as Veronica called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Veronica began, standing at the podium with perfect posture. "I've called this emergency session to address a serious security concern in our community." She clicked a remote, and a grainy photo of Joe working in the garden at 1842 Maple appeared on the screen. This individual has been repeatedly seen on the vacant property at 1842 Maple Avenue. Despite multiple warnings, he continues to trespass and make unauthorized changes to the property. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Judge Eleanor Bailey raised her hand. "Point of order, Veronica. Has the actual property owner complained about this person's presence?" Veronica hesitated. "We've been unable to make direct contact with the owner, which is part of the problem. The property is owned by a corporate entity called JW Holdings." "And has JW Holdings filed a complaint?" Eleanor pressed. "Not yet, but as HOA president, it's my duty to protect all properties in our community," Veronica replied smoothly. "This individual refuses to provide proper identification or authorization. He's changing the landscape without permission and has been confrontational when approached." From the back of the room, Joe watched as several residents nodded in agreement. Veronica continued, "I propose we allocate funds from the HOA budget to increase security patrols and install additional cameras. Furthermore, I recommend we amend our bylaws to require all landscapers and service personnel to wear visible ID badges approved by the HOA." As the discussion heated up, Thomas Bailey, Eleanor's husband and a retired attorney, spoke up. "Before we vote on any of this, shouldn't we verify whether this person actually has permission to be there? For all we know, he could be authorized by the owner." "I've tried," Veronica exclaimed, frustration evident in her voice. "JW Holdings doesn't respond to inquiries. Meanwhile, this person continues to trespass daily." Eleanor exchanged glances with her husband. "Perhaps we should table this discussion until we have more information?" "We don't have time for delays," Veronica insisted. "This is about community safety. Would you want some random person hanging around your property, refusing to identify themselves properly? What if he's casing houses for robbery? What if he's dangerous?" Joe sat quietly, observing as Veronica skillfully played on the fears of residents who didn't know him. He noticed how she carefully avoided explicit mentions of race while using coded language that achieved the same effect. As the meeting progressed, Veronica outlined her plan to secure the neighborhood, which included reporting suspicious individuals to police immediately and requiring additional verification for all visitors. The subtext was clear to anyone paying attention. When the time came to vote, Joe finally stood up. A hush fell over the room as people recognized him. "Mr. Williams," Veronica said icily, "how unexpected to see you here. This is a residents-only meeting, is it?" Joe replied mildly. "Then I'm right where I should be." Veronica's eyes narrowed. "You're not a Whispering Pines resident." Joe walked slowly to the front of the room. "Actually, Ms. Prescott, I've owned property in Whispering Pines for 15 years. "Which property?" she challenged. Joe smiled. "Several, actually, including 1842 Maple Avenue." A shocked murmur swept through the crowd. "That's impossible," Veronica sputtered. 1842 Maple is owned by JW Holdings." "Yes," Joe agreed. "Joseph Williams Holdings. JW Holdings, for short." The room erupted in whispers as understanding dawned on the residents' faces. Veronica stood frozen at the podium, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling around her. "You're lying," she finally managed. "Where's your proof?" Joe reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, handing it to Thomas Bailey. "My attorney can provide all the necessary documentation. I own 17 properties in Whispering Pines, including the one you've been targeting with violation notices." As Thomas confirmed the information on the card, Veronica's face paled. "If this is true, why didn't you just say so from the beginning?" Joe regarded her thoughtfully. "Would it have mattered, Ms. Prescott? Would you have treated me differently if you'd known I owned the house? Because the way I see it, everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of what they own or what they look like." The meeting dissolved into chaos as residents began questioning Veronica's motives. Joe quietly made his exit, knowing that this was only the beginning. What Veronica still didn't know, what would truly shock her, was that her own rental home at 367 Sycamore Drive was also part of JW Holdings' portfolio. As Joe drove home, he decided it was time to pay a visit to the courthouse. Veronica Prescott needed to learn that appearances could be deceiving, and that her actions had consequences far beyond a simple garden dispute. The county courthouse buzzed with activity as Veronica Prescott strutted through the main entrance, designer handbag swinging confidently from her arm. 3 weeks had passed since the explosive HOA meeting, but rather than backing down, Veronica had doubled down on her campaign against Joe Williams. She'd spent days researching property records, convinced she would find evidence that Joe was lying about his ownership. After discovering that JW Holdings did indeed own multiple properties in Whispering Pines, she pivoted to a new strategy, finding technical violations of HOA rules that would force Joe to comply with her authority. Today, she was filing formal eviction proceedings against him for unauthorized occupancy. Her lawyer had advised against it, but Veronica was certain she'd found a loophole. While Joe might own 1842 Maple Avenue, the HOA bylaws clearly stated that residents must be officially registered with the association. Since Joe's primary residence was outside the gates of Whispering Pines, she argued he had no right to stay overnight at the property as he had been doing while preparing it for new tenants. I have an appointment with Judge Rodriguez regarding case number WP 2023-114, Veronica told the clerk, sliding her driver's license across the counter. The clerk glanced at the ID. Ms. Prescott, yes. The judge is expecting you. Room 304, third floor. Veronica smiled triumphantly. Finally, she would put Joe Williams in his place and restore proper order to Whispering Pines. When she entered courtroom 304, Veronica was surprised to find it empty except for a familiar figure sitting calmly in the front row. Good morning, Ms. Prescott, Joe said pleasantly, dressed in an impeccable navy suit that looked nothing like his gardening attire. Veronica faltered momentarily before regaining her composure. Mr. Williams, I'm surprised to see you here. Did you receive advance notice of this hearing? Joe smiled. I didn't need notice, Ms. Prescott. I requested this meeting. Before Veronica could respond, the side door opened and Judge Eleanor Bailey entered, taking her seat at the bench. Judge Bailey, Veronica stammered. I thought Judge Rodriguez was presiding today. Judge Rodriguez recused himself due to a conflict of interest, Eleanor explained. This matter falls within my jurisdiction. Veronica's confidence wavered. Your Honor, with all due respect, you and Mr. Williams appear to be friends. Shouldn't you also recuse yourself? I've disclosed my acquaintance with both parties, Eleanor replied. Now, shall we proceed? Veronica reluctantly took her seat, arranging her documents meticulously before her. Your Honor, as president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, I'm filing for enforcement of our bylaws against Mr. Williams, who has been occupying 1842 Maple Avenue without proper registration as a resident. Judge Bailey nodded. I've reviewed your filing, Ms. Prescott. Mr. Williams, would you like to respond? Joe stood slowly. Your Honor, I'm not contesting the fact that I haven't registered as a resident. That's because I'm not a resident of 1842 Maple Avenue. I'm the property owner preparing it for new tenants. The distinction is irrelevant, Veronica interrupted. Section 14.3 of our bylaws clearly states that anyone staying overnight on a property must be registered with the HOA. Mr. Williams has been living at this address for weeks. I've been working late, Joe clarified. My primary residence remains at 215 Oakwood Drive. Judge Bailey turned to Veronica. Ms. Prescott, is there anything in your bylaws that prevents a property owner from working on their own property? Not explicitly, but... And does Mr. Williams need HOA approval to be present on his own property? Well, no, but... Then on what grounds are you seeking this eviction? Veronica straightened in her chair. Your Honor, this is about maintaining community standards. Mr. Williams has been deceptive about his identity and refused to comply with multiple requests for proper documentation. Interesting, Judge Bailey mused. Mr. Williams, have you refused to identify yourself to Ms. Prescott? I identified myself correctly as Joe Williams, he replied. I wasn't aware I needed to produce a property deed to garden on my own land. Judge Bailey nodded thoughtfully. I see. Ms. Prescott, it appears your case lacks substantive grounds. However, before I rule, Mr. Williams has filed a counter-motion that we need to address. This caught Veronica by surprise. Counter-motion? What counter-motion? Joe spoke quietly. Your Honor, I filed a formal complaint against Ms. Prescott for harassment, discriminatory behavior, and abuse of HOA authority. The blood drained from Veronica's face. That's absurd. I was simply enforcing the rules. Were you? Joe asked, removing a tablet from his briefcase. With the court's permission, I'd like to present evidence. Judge Bailey nodded, and Joe activated the courtroom display screen. A series of security camera footage began to play, showing Veronica's multiple confrontations with Joe, each time escalating in hostility despite his calm responses. These cameras were installed for property security, Joe explained. They've captured Ms. Prescott's behavior over the past month, including several instances where racial bias appeared to motivate her actions. The footage continued, showing Veronica telling neighbors that Joe didn't belong in Whispering Pines and suggesting he might be dangerous despite no evidence. Veronica's face flushed with anger. This is being taken out of context. I had legitimate concerns about an unidentified person making changes to neighborhood property. Perhaps, Joe acknowledged. But the evidence suggests you enforced rules selectively. During the same period, 7 other homeowners made landscaping changes without formal HOA approval. None received violation notices. He displayed a chart showing all recent property modifications and which ones Veronica had cited. The pattern was unmistakable. Furthermore, Joe continued, I've received testimony from security personnel that Ms. Prescott specifically instructed them to watch for suspicious individuals matching my description. Judge Bailey reviewed the evidence carefully. Ms. Prescott, do you have any response to these allegations? Veronica's hands trembled slightly as she shuffled her papers. Your Honor, I reject any implication of discrimination. My actions were solely motivated by protecting property values and community standards. I see, Judge Bailey said. And what about the allegation that you've abused your position as HOA president to pursue a personal vendetta? Ridiculous. Veronica scoffed. I've acted within my authority. Joe cleared his throat. There's one more piece of evidence, Your Honor. He slid a document across to the judge. This is a property record for 367 Sycamore Drive, where Ms. Prescott currently resides. Judge Bailey examined the document. This shows the property is owned by JW Holdings. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom as Veronica stared in disbelief. That's impossible, she whispered. I'm afraid it's true, Ms. Prescott, Joe said gently. You've been renting one of my properties through Lakeside Property Management, a subsidiary of JW Holdings. The same company you've been targeting with your campaign. Veronica's face cycled through shock, disbelief, and finally, horror as the realization dawned. You're my landlord. Yes, ma'am. And I own approximately 40% of the properties in Whispering Pines, including 6 currently serving as homes for HOA board members. The revelation hit Veronica like a physical blow. All this time, while she'd been trying to assert her authority over this man she had judged as beneath her, he had literally owned the roof over her head. Had you bothered to check property records before launching your campaign, Joe continued, you might have discovered this. Instead, you made assumptions based on appearances and acted on those assumptions without proper diligence. Judge Bailey cleared her throat. Given the evidence presented, I'm dismissing Ms. Prescott's eviction filing as without merit. Regarding Mr. Williams' harassment complaint, I find sufficient evidence to proceed with a formal hearing. She fixed Veronica with a stern look. Ms. Prescott, I strongly suggest you consult with legal counsel. As the judge rose to leave, Veronica sat frozen in her chair, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Joe gathered his documents slowly, giving Veronica time to process what had happened. When they were alone in the courtroom, he finally spoke. Ms. Prescott, I'm not interested in vengeance. I don't plan to evict you from your home. Veronica looked up, confusion swimming in her eyes. Why not? After everything I did. Because treating people poorly doesn't teach them to treat others better, Joe replied. It just perpetuates the cycle. So what happens now? She asked hoarsely. That depends on you, Joe said. The HOA will need to elect a new president, as I suspect your position has become untenable. Beyond that, I have a proposition. He sat down beside her. Whispering Pines has a community service requirement for all residents that's rarely enforced. I'd like you to fulfill your hours by helping with a neighborhood beautification project I've been planning, the one you've been trying to shut down. Veronica stared at him incredulously. You want me to garden with you? After everything that's happened, I think working together might teach us both something, Joe said. You'd be surprised what you can learn about people when you're willing to get your hands dirty alongside them. For the first time, Veronica looked at Joe, really looked at him, not as an intruder or an adversary, but as a human being. "I don't know if I can do that," she admitted quietly. "I don't expect you to decide today," Joe replied, standing up. "Take some time to consider it. My roses could use another pair of hands." As he walked toward the door, Veronica called after him. "Mr. Williams, why did you let it go this far? You could have told me who you were from the beginning." Joe paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Would it have changed how you treated me? Or would it have just changed how you hid your treatment of me?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswered. 3 weeks later, residents of Whispering Pines were treated to an unusual sight. Veronica Prescott, dressed in casual clothes with her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, working alongside Joe Williams in the community garden. Her designer clothes and air of superiority were gone, replaced by a quieter, more thoughtful demeanor. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something more valuable, a chance for growth for both of them. As they worked side by side, transforming the entrance to Whispering Pines with vibrant flowers and fragrant herbs, they were also transforming themselves and perhaps the community they both called home.